All right, good afternoon. I'm filming a video today for Mark of Planet Mojo, showing the next step in the journey for the grapes that Mark has been growing. My name is Jed from Wood Grain Winery, and we purchased Mark's lot of grapes this year. And exchanging a couple emails with him, I came to learn that he has a YouTube channel, quite a popular YouTube channel, and I wanted to cut some films here to show you these grapes along their process of becoming a world-class wine. So one of the things I wanted to show you today was punch downs in red grapes. So when you ferment red grapes, you ferment them with the skin-ons. So you take the grape and you crush it, destem it. You press the juice off of the grapes, but you add back in these skins to the juice during ferment. At least the style of wine that I make, that's how you do it. And part of that is those skins float to the top. We can actually see some of that here in these translucent bins. These are smaller fermenting bins that I have that I use for overflow. Majority of the fermentation and actually all of Mark's grapes are in this fermenter here, which we'll talk about shortly. All right, so we have here, this is a good example of where you can see the different parts of a wine in ferment. You have at the top, you're going to see the grape skins themselves. Inside of this vessel is what winemakers would call must. Beer makers, when they're fermenting, call their liquid that they're fermenting mash, but winemakers, we call it must. The top part here, you can see the grape skins floating. Down below, you have your must, which turns into wine. And at the bottom, you have what you would call the gross lees, or stuff that falls out, the heavier particles of the dead yeast cells that fall to the bottom. So if we look at this must at this point in time, we wanted to show you punch down. So we're going to take off the lid here. You can see in here, this is actually quite far along in fermentation. Fermentation's pretty much finished, but you'll still get the visual. You can see the grape skins floating at the top. What we do when we're making red wine is we punch this down at least 3 times a day. The goal would be to keep this moving. You can see that wine, at this point in time, it's wine coming up through that cap of those grapes. And the goal would be when we're making wine in the primary fermentation stage is to always have this cap wet and have it as moving as much as possible. Now again, as I mentioned before, this is our kind of overflow fermenting. We actually have a primary fermenter which does punch downs automatically. This is called a Go fermenter. We're fermenting here. I'm going to demonstrate this. You can see down inside here we have the must and the grape skins and the wine right inside of there. And it's fermenting inside of a plastic bag. Now, one of the advantages that the Go fermenter does and why we use this equipment is it can do auto punch downs. It has an equipment here, which we'll show you in a second, and inflates this blue bag. The blue bag gets very large, and which punches the wine up through the top of the cap, keeping that cap wet and keeping it moving like we want to do. Now, the advantage is you can automatically set this to do as frequently as you want. And how that makes the wine better is, let's say we were to go do punch downs at 10 o'clock at night, you go to bed, you wake up the next morning and do punch downs again, maybe the next morning at 8 o'clock in the morning. During that period of time, those 10 hours or more in between punch downs, the temperature variation in your must, so the temperature from the cap to the wine changes, and it fluctuates quite a bit, which gives you effects in the wine and the end taste of the wine. If you can keep that cap and wine the same temperature, or relatively the same temperature throughout the ferment, you can have a higher quality wine. And I set mine to punch every 4 hours, and that I can watch actually on my temperature probes a consistent temperature throughout the fermentation of that wine, which is very beneficial. One of the other benefits of using this equipment rather than stainless steel, you almost never come in contact with the wine. So every time you do a punch down, if you don't sterilize your equipment correctly, this punch down, whatever you're using to punch the grapes down into the wine, if you don't sterilize it correctly, you increase the risk of introducing bacteria and other things you just don't want in your wine. And in the end, you could have a wine that has what they would call VA, or volatile acidity, a bacteria that takes off in there that really gives you a taste that nobody's going to drink. So that happens to many winemakers. You can reduce the amount of contact that you have with a plastic type bag type situation as this. So let me show you some punch downs. I'm going to show you a couple things. I'm going to edit in here some of the pictures. I didn't take video when I was actually making the must, but I do have some pictures, so I'm going to show you some clips of those pictures here. And after I show you the clips of the pictures, I'd like to demonstrate the auto punch down process of this, which is kind of cool. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the next steps for Mark's grapes, Mark's Planet Mojo grapes, after we have them at this stage. So we showed you them in this would be called primary fermentation. We're just finishing primary fermentation here, and on the next day, we're gonna be scooping out those grape skins, both out of Mark's grapes in the Go Fermenter and our overflow grapes that we got from a second vineyard. We're gonna be scooping those out and we're gonna be pressing them off. So here is an example of a press. This particular press is a bladder press. Pressing matters a great deal in the quality of wine that you end up with when you're making red wines. Not only the pressure, but the amount of time that you're pressing. And this type of press here gives me the ability on the scale that I'm working with to control those things. I can control the amount of pressure that this bladder pushes out. I can control the thickness of the grapes. You actually don't want to press grapes over 8 inches thick when you're using a press. I can control many variables, but we're going to be scooping out those wine soaked skins at this point in time, pressing off the red wine and introducing that back to the fermenters. And as part of that, a lot of tannins are going to come out of those skins when we're pressing them, and those tannins are going to help clear out that wine. They'll actually get in there with the wine. They'll drop a lot of the other sediment to the bottom, so we'll have to let them sit for a short period of time. Then we're going to be taking that wine and pumping it into tank. I can talk to you a little bit about tanks here. I'm actually going to go grab an example of a tank, and we'll show you some modern tanks that people are using that are equivalents to oak tanks. And I'll talk about some of the benefits that you get from using this type of tanking system. Let's talk a little bit about barrels and where this wine is going to end up next. So after we press off the skins, we're going to end up transferring it into tanks. And I have one of the smaller tanks that I use in front of me. That's a 30-gallon tank there. The majority of the tanks that we use are 120 or 80 gallons, but I have smaller tanks around in case we have extra wine and need a place to put it. But these tanks are specially designed to allow the wine to breathe, very much like an oak barrel. Oak barrels have been used for decades and centuries in making wine, and they increase the quality of red wine because over months and years of keeping the red wine in an oak barrel, that barrel breathes, and it breathes very slowly. It lets in oxygen, very small amounts of oxygen, which helps build the structure of the wine and do several other great things to wine over time. These flex tanks are designed to do the exact same thing. They breathe slowly over time, letting in oxygen, off-gassing methols and other bad things that came from the fermenting process. So it smooths out that wine, makes it taste better, and that's why we use them. There's some downsides to oak barrels that I think these flex tanks overcome as well. If you've ever tasted an extremely oaky wine, if you take a brand new oak barrel and put wine in it, the wine, in my opinion, can be almost undrinkable due to how oaky it is. Now there's ways to manage that. Very talented and skilled winemakers who use oak can overcome that, obviously. One of the other downsides, in my opinion, to oak barrels would be if you leave it in there for about a year, certain chemicals are given off by that oak at the 10 to 12 month range that can negatively impact the taste of your wine. Again, there's ways to manage that, and skilled winemakers do. A third downside to oak barrels, in my opinion, is the cost. They can literally be 4 times as expensive as these tanks that I use, flex tanks. So there's a easier entry to the market with these flex tanks. We should talk a bit about oxygen. Oxygen in wine is quite an interesting thing. If you were to take a glass of wine, pour pour wine into a glass and leave it out on the counter overnight, you would experience one of the wine faults, one of the 5 wine faults, which is oxygenation. So too much oxygen for any wine, red or white, is bad. But you want a small amount of oxygen to increase the quality of wine. One of the other steps that we're going to be doing this year with our larger tanks is micro-oxygenation. So we invested in some tools to introduce 30 to 40 times the barrel equivalent of micro-oxygen into a barrel, into one of our tanks over the period of a month, which does a lot of amazing things for a wine. It changes the velvetyness of the tannins on your tongue. It changes the mouthfeel of that red wine. It changes the structure of the wine in just really wonderful ways. You do have to age wine for a year or two when using that type of technology, which we plan to do. So Mark's grapes here in the gray fermenter are going to be put into barrel. We'll bring them through micro-oxygenation, and we're going to be storing them and managing the free SO2, so that keep bacteria and other things away. We'll be managing the free SO2 and the TA in the wine over that long period of time. We'll also be working with them with some specialized oak chips to introduce specific flavors that we want into that wine as well, such as vanilla and other ones. So lots to come in that wine. I can't wait to send Mark a couple bottles in 2 years. All right, to end with, I just wanted to thank Mark for the opportunity to share this phase in the winemaking process, and for the extremely high quality fruit. Having visited with Mark several times throughout the season, I came to understand his vineyard management practices, and they are of the highest quality, and that showed through in the fruit that I was working with this fall in these grapes. This was amazing fruit. It's going to make some amazing wine. I'm very fortunate to have that opportunity. Thank you, Mark. And if I could, I wouldn't mind plugging my Facebook and my newsletter to the people that follow Mark. If you want to follow along with our vineyard project and our winery project, you can find us on Facebook at Wood Grain Winery. So that's one word, Wood Grain, second word, Winery. Also, if you don't do the Facebook, you can send me an email at woodgrainwinery@gmail.com. So it's woodgrainwinery@gmail.com, and I do send out a newsletter with links to videos probably 4 times a year. So if you want to follow along with the project and learn when wine will be available from Mark's grapes, send us an email. Thank you.